The morning above New York belonged to Homelander, and he wore it the way a king wears a crown that has never been questioned. He drifted just beneath the clouds, arms folded, cape rippling in a wind that seemed too obedient to be natural. Below him, the city moved in its usual choreography of sirens, engines, and small human ambitions, and every eye that turned upward for him. He had grown accustomed to that gravity of attention. He had begun to believe it was owed. Inside Vought Tower, the walls were lined with images of his triumphs. Every screen played a different version of the same story. Homelander lifting a collapsed bridge. Homelander pulling a child from a burning car that had been carefully arranged the night before. Homelander smiling into a camera that had been placed at the exact angle to catch the sunlight in his hair. The men who wrote his myth stood around a long glass table, whispering into headsets, adjusting narratives the way tailors adjust seams. He watched them through the floor-to-ceiling window and felt a familiar amusement. They believed they were shaping him. He allowed them to believe it. There had been a time when he studied their faces for approval. That time was gone. Recent months had taught him something intoxicating. He no longer needed to be loved. He needed only to be feared, and fear, unlike love, did not require maintenance. It grew on its own, quietly, in the small hesitations of people who used to meet his eyes. He had begun to test the edges of that fear. A week earlier, he had crushed a robber on live television, laughing as the man begged. The network had cut away. The ratings had climbed. A day later, he had insulted a senator on air and watched the country debate whether the senator had deserved it. He had humiliated 3 other heroes in a single press conference, dismissing them as costumed children pretending to matter. Vought had winced. The public had cheered. He had understood then that the leash he had worn since childhood was no longer attached to anything. Yet somewhere beneath the satisfaction, a smaller feeling had begun to stir. It was not doubt. Doubt was a word for weaker men. It was closer to hunger. He had begun to wonder, in the quiet hours before dawn, whether there was anything left in the world capable of resisting him. The thought did not frighten him. It bored him. A god without opposition was only a decoration. Then the reports came. They arrived first as fragments buried inside classified briefings. An unexplained energy signature had bloomed across the upper atmosphere and vanished before instruments could resolve it. 2 satellites had lost contact with one another for 4 seconds over the Atlantic. A pilot flying above the Sierra Nevada had described a silhouette standing on nothing, framed against the sun, and had been quietly grounded for evaluation. A fisherman near the Azores had photographed a streak of blue light climbing straight upward into a sky that had no storm to explain it. Vaught's analysts assumed the obvious. Another enhanced individual. Another product of some rival laboratory or foreign program. They spoke of containment, acquisition, and, if necessary, elimination. They spoke the way men speak when they have never met the thing they intend to catch. Homelander listened without interrupting. He studied the grainy images on the conference screen. He tilted his head slightly, the way a hawk tilts its head at movement in a distant field. Where the analysts saw a problem, he saw a possibility. Where they saw a threat, he saw a stage that had suddenly grown larger. He did not want another subordinate. He wanted a rival. He wanted someone the world could line up beside him so that the world could finally understand the difference. Far from the tower, far from the cameras, far from the manufactured weather of Vaught's kingdom, a man was walking along a coastline that had no name on any tourist map. His footprints did not sink into the wet sand the way footprints should. He wore ordinary clothes. He carried nothing. His name was Adam Brashear, and the world had spent years learning to forget him. He had returned to Earth's public sphere because the atmosphere had told him to. He had felt the disturbance the way a physician feels a fever through fabric. Something inside the delicate lattice of the world had begun to bend under the weight of an experiment that did not understand itself. He had traced the distortion to a compound, and the compound to a company, and the company to a man who smiled too widely on billboards. Adam did not want fame. He had held fame once, briefly, and had watched it curdle into fear the moment the public learned what he was capable of. He had chosen the long silence instead. He had spent those years reading, thinking, calculating, and, above all, restraining himself. He had come to understand that immense power was not a possession, it was a debt. Every action he took was a withdrawal from an account whose balance no one else could see. The contrast between the 2 men had already been written into the shape of the coming days. though neither of them yet knew the exact hour it would arrive. Homelander believed power granted him authority. Adam believed power imposed responsibility. Homelander believed the world existed to reflect him. Adam believed the world existed regardless of him, and that his only task was to keep it from breaking. That evening, in a glass room high above the city, an aide leaned toward Homelander and spoke a name for the first time. Blue Marvel. Homelander repeated it softly, tasting the syllables. He expected to feel irritation, perhaps a flicker of the boredom that had lately hollowed his days. Instead, something warmer moved through him. A slow, private smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He had found someone worth breaking. Outside the window, a single cloud drifted across the sun, and for one brief moment, the light in the room dimmed, as if the sky itself had heard him. Vought did what Vought had always done. It took a private ambition and dressed it in spectacle. Within 3 days of that whispered name, the machinery of the company had spun a challenge into an event, and the event into a global promise. Billboards changed overnight. Talk shows abandoned their planned segments. Airlines reported a strange spike in tickets to a city that had not yet been named. The world, half amused and half afraid, leaned forward in its seat. Homelander stood at the center of the storm and enjoyed it the way a fire enjoys dry wood. He walked onto the stage of the largest arena in the country, while 100,000 voices climbed toward him. The lights were arranged to make his cape look larger than his body. The music had been chosen by a team of psychologists. Every element of the moment had been engineered, and yet he moved through it as though it had all been invented that morning for his convenience. He raised a hand. The crowd hushed. He smiled the smile that had been focus-tested in 12 countries. He spoke to the cameras, not to the audience. He said the name Blue Marvel the way a hunter says the name of an animal he has already skinned in his mind. He said he had heard whispers of a man who thought himself above the world. He said he had heard rumors of a coward who hid behind clouds. He invited that man, whoever he was, to step into the light. He promised, with the easy generosity of the untested, that the world deserved to see them stand together. He did not know enough about Adam Brashear to understand the mistake he had just made. To Homelander, the challenge was theater. He expected one of 3 outcomes. Submission, in which Blue Marvel would appear humbled and be absorbed into Vought's roster. Disappearance, in which the man would vanish and be mocked into irrelevance. Or collapse, in which he would arrive already defeated by the sheer weight of Homelander's presence. Any of the 3 would serve. Any of the 3 would remind the world that there was a hierarchy, and that he stood alone at its top. Adam watched the broadcast from a small apartment in a city he did not particularly love. The television had been left on by the previous tenant. He had not thought to turn it off. He sat with his hands folded, listening to a man he had never met promise the world a war. He did not answer that night. He answered the following morning, and he did so without cameras. He walked into a local news station in Baltimore, past a receptionist who did not recognize him, and asked politely to use a microphone. The producer, sensing something she could not name, said yes. Adam sat down. He looked into the lens. He spoke for less than a minute. He said he had no desire to fight Homelander. He said that a fight between them would help no one and would harm a great many. He said that he understood the appeal of spectacle, but that spectacle had a cost, and that the cost was usually paid by people who had never agreed to attend. He thanked the producer, stood, and left. He was gone before the footage finished uploading. The clip spread faster than any Vought campaign had ever moved. It was not the words. It was the calm. There was no fear in his face. There was no anger. There was only a man who had already weighed the situation and found it unworthy of his violence. Homelander watched the clip alone, in a room whose walls had been designed to absorb sound. He watched it once. He watched it again. He watched it a 3rd time, and by the 3rd viewing, the small, warm smile of the previous evening had turned into something colder. He had prepared himself for defiance. He had prepared himself for silence. He had not prepared himself for restraint. Restraint was a word he associated with weakness, and yet the man on the screen wore it like armor. He decided, in the space of a single breath, that restraint was fear in a better suit. The media obliged him. Panels of pundits debated whether Blue Marvel had refused because he was principled or because he was terrified. Vought seeded the second interpretation into every outlet it owned, and there were more of those than most viewers realized. Within a week, the story had been rewritten. Blue Marvel was not calm. He was cowering. Homelander was not aggressive. He was patient. The confrontation was not manufactured. It was inevitable. Behind the noise, Adam worked. He moved through Vought's public records the way a surgeon moves through tissue. He read financial disclosures, patent filings, and the redacted testimony of scientists who had left the company under agreements that forbade them from speaking. He followed a compound across 3 continents in 4 decades. He learned the name Compound V and understood, within an afternoon, that it was not a serum, it was a wound. Vought had opened a wound in the human species and had been widening it for profit. He learned about the children. He learned about the contracts. He learned about the failures that had been buried in unmarked graves and the successes that had been paraded across magazine covers. He learned that Homelander was not simply the strongest of Vought's products. He was the purest expression of its philosophy. A man raised without love, taught without limits, and rewarded for every cruelty that entertained a camera. Adam closed his research and sat for a long time in a room that had grown dark around him. He understood then that he was not being called to fight a villain. He was being called to answer a system, and the system, unlike Homelander, could not be punched. Meanwhile, in a private gymnasium at the top of Vought Tower, Homelander studied his opponent with the obsessive attention of a man who had never before needed to study anyone. He replayed every clip of Blue Marvel that existed. He memorized the way Adam walked, the way he tilted his head, the way his voice lowered when he spoke of civilians. He told himself he was hunting for weakness. In truth, he was hunting for a promise. He wanted proof that this man could be broken, because a man who could not be broken was a mirror, and Homelander had never been able to look into a mirror for long. The confrontation was scheduled. A field outside a small coastal town was chosen for its cinematic vistas. Adam quietly contacted the town's mayor and asked her to evacuate. She did. Homelander interpreted the empty streets as another sign of fear. On the appointed morning, both men arrived. The cameras turned on. The world held its breath. And somewhere above them, a single cloud drifted across the sun again, as though the sky had learned to mark the beginning of things. The field had been chosen for its beauty. Long grass, a distant line of pines, a sky that seemed painted rather than lived in. Vought's producers had wanted a backdrop that would look good in slow motion, and they had gotten one. What they had not anticipated was how quiet the place would feel once the crowds were held back and the drones settled into their orbits. The wind moved through the grass with a soft, patient sound, and for a moment the loudest thing in the world was that whisper. Homelander floated above the field like a small red sun. He turned slowly in the air, letting each camera catch its preferred angle. He smiled at the drones. He waved at the horizon. He performed the confidence he had been paid all his life to perform, and he performed it well enough that even he almost believed it. Blue Marvel stood on the ground. His feet were planted in the grass. His hands hung at his sides. He wore a suit that looked more like a uniform than a costume, and his expression carried the mild, attentive stillness of a man waiting for a train he did not particularly wish to board. Homelander taunted him first. He spoke loudly enough for the microphones and softly enough for intimacy. He asked whether Blue Marvel intended to stand there all day. He suggested that perhaps the great scientist had forgotten how to fly. He offered with theatrical generosity to demonstrate. Adam said nothing. He did not even look up. The refusal to react was, to Homelander, the final permission. He struck. His heat vision tore across the field with enough force to vaporize steel. The grass beneath the beam turned instantly to ash, and a long black line opened in the earth as though a scalpel had been drawn across the world. The beam reached Blue Marvel and stopped. It did not glance away. It did not scatter. It simply ended, absorbed into him the way a shout is absorbed into a wall. The light died. The grass around Adam's feet was untouched. He had not moved. Homelander's smile faltered for the first time in years. It was a small failure of the face, quick enough that most viewers missed it, but the cameras caught it and would replay it later 1,000 times. Confusion is a stranger to men who have never lost, and it does not know how to arrange itself politely on their features. He attacked again. He accelerated toward Adam at a speed that shattered every window in the coastal town 3 miles away. He drew back his fist. He put into that single blow the full accumulated weight of years of unopposed strength. Blue Marvel raised one hand. The impact produced a shockwave that flattened the grass in a perfect circle for 100 yards. Homelander was not stopped. He was redirected. He tore through a stand of pines, through a stone outbuilding, through a decorative wall Vought had erected for the visuals, and came to rest inside a shallow crater a quarter-mile from where he had begun. Dust rose around him in a slow, embarrassed cloud. The world watched in stunned silence. Even the commentators, whose entire profession was the filling of silence, forgot how to speak. Homelander rose. He rose slowly, and he rose furious. He tore the dust from his shoulders. He tore the calm from his face. He tore, from somewhere deep inside himself, a scream that the microphones only partially captured, and he launched himself back into the sky. What followed was not a fight. It was a demonstration. Homelander threw everything he had ever been taught to throw: superhuman speed, brute force, heat vision at frequencies Vought had never publicly acknowledged, aerial attacks executed at angles designed to bypass defensive posture. He struck from above, from below, from behind. He tried to lift Adam. He tried to bury him. He tried to blind him. He tried, finally, to simply outlast him, hammering at the same shoulder again and again with the mindless persistence of a child beating a locked door. Adam absorbed the punishment. He did not counterattack. He watched. His eyes tracked every movement with a scientist's patience, cataloging angles, measuring forces, noting the small tells that betrayed emotion in his opponent. He was not fighting Homelander. He was reading him. That was the revelation the cameras began to broadcast, whether Vought wanted them to or not. Blue Marvel was not merely stronger. He understood exactly how dangerous the man in front of him was, and he was refusing to fight him the way that man wanted to be fought. Homelander needed a rival who would swing wildly, who would grow angry, who would make mistakes. Adam gave him none of these gifts. Homelander's tactics began to fray. He had never been forced to invent a new strategy in the middle of a battle. He had always won early, and the winning had spared him from having to learn. Now, 3 minutes into a fight that his own team had scheduled to last 40, he began to feel a sensation he did not recognize. It rose from his chest into his throat and settled behind his eyes. It was not fear, not yet. It was the shadow that fear casts before it arrives. He redoubled his assault out of instinct, and instinct, at last, produced a result. A strike landed. A real one. His fist connected with Adam's jaw, and Adam staggered a half-step backward. For a single breath, the world tilted in Homelander's favor. He hung in the air above his opponent, chest heaving, and allowed himself to believe that the balance had returned. He allowed himself, briefly, to be who he had always been. Then Blue Marvel straightened. He rolled his neck once, thoughtfully, the way a man rolls his neck after a long flight. He looked up at Homelander, and for the first time he spoke. "You do not understand," he said, "the difference between being powerful and being invincible." Homelander charged. He charged with a noise that did not sound entirely human. Adam caught him. He caught him mid-air, one hand around his wrist, one hand against his chest, and the impact of that catch rang across the coast like a bell struck inside a mountain. The clouds above them rippled outward in a perfect ring. Windows shattered in 3 towns. Somewhere a church bell began to ring on its own. Adam held him for a long moment. He looked into his eyes. Then he threw him, not to kill, not to maim. He threw him aside, the way a man sets down a tool he has finished using, and he turned his back on him. He walked toward the civilians who had gathered, despite every warning, at the edge of the field. He knelt beside a frightened child. He asked, gently, whether anyone had been hurt. Homelander, rising once again from another crater, saw the turned back and understood. He was not the greatest threat in the room. He was not even the most important thing in it. He was a distraction Adam had chosen to set aside. The humiliation went deeper than any wound. The footage did not need editing. It edited itself. Within an hour, every network on the planet was running the same 3 seconds on a loop. Homelander tearing through pines. Homelander crumpled in a crater. Homelander, most damningly of all, being turned away from as though he did not merit a second glance. The images played beneath anchors who did not know quite how to speak about them, and their uncertainty traveled through the screens into living rooms, and from living rooms into the streets. Memes appeared before the dust had finished settling. A still frame of Homelander mid-flight, arms flailing, was captioned with the words of 100 private grievances. Children imitated the pose in schoolyards. A late-night comedian, who had spent the previous decade praising him, opened his monologue with a single raised hand and a shockwave sound effect, and the studio audience laughed for a full minute before he could speak again. The markets reacted next. Vought's stock, which had climbed for 11 consecutive quarters, opened the following morning down 14%. By noon, it had shed a fifth of its value. Analysts who had once described the company as recession-proof began to use the word exposure. Pension funds quietly rebalanced. A senator who had accepted Vought money for years appeared on a Sunday program and pretended, with impressive conviction, that he had always harbored concerns. Beneath the financial tremor, something deeper began to move. Ordinary people who had spent their lives being told that Homelander was the ceiling of what a human being could be, began to ask a question they had not previously been permitted to ask aloud. If he could be beaten, what else had they been told that was not true? If the strongest man in the world was not the strongest man in the world, then perhaps the safest company in the world was not the safest company in the world. Perhaps the heroes were not heroes. Perhaps the compound was not medicine. Perhaps the smiling faces on the billboards had been smiling at something the audience had not been shown. Homelander did not watch the coverage. He listened to it. He sat in the private penthouse at the top of Vought Tower with every screen turned off and every window sealed, and he listened through the walls to the low murmur of the city below. He could hear individual conversations if he chose to focus. He chose to focus. He heard laughter. He heard pity. He heard once a child asking a mother whether Homelander was going to cry. The mother had shushed the child. The shushing had been worse than the question. He destroyed the penthouse in stages. He began with the furniture. He moved to the appliances. He tore a marble counter from its base and threw it through a window that had been engineered to withstand a missile. He stood, at last, in a room that looked as though a storm had passed through it, and he found that he did not feel any better. The rage had not left him. It had only rearranged the room around him. He summoned the executives. They arrived pale and quick. He demanded every file Vought possessed on Blue Marvel. He demanded them within the hour. He demanded them without redaction, without summary, without the polite fictions that Vought normally applied to unpleasant information. The executives, who had spent their careers learning when to obey and when to negotiate, obeyed. The files were extensive. They were also useless. Adam Brashear had lived a life that did not fit neatly inside a folder. There were academic papers whose citations circled back into themselves. There were photographs of him at gatherings whose other attendees had died decades earlier. There were satellite images that suggested he had visited the moon without any known vehicle. There were medical scans that showed nothing at all because instruments had returned only static when pointed at him. Vought's analysts, who had built their careers on the reassuring solidity of Compound 5, found themselves staring at a man who did not resolve. That, more than the defeat itself, unsettled Homelander. He could accept, in a private corner of his mind, that he had lost a fight. He could not accept that he had lost a fight to a phenomenon he could not name. He needed his enemy to have a category. He needed Adam to be a serum, a mutation, a project, a mistake. He needed a box. Vought's scientists, working through nights that grew indistinguishable from days, eventually produced a partial answer. Blue Marvel's powers were connected to a form of energy that did not behave like anything in their catalogs. It was not the raw physical enhancement of Compound V. It was something that appeared to interact with the fabric of space itself, drawing on reserves that were not stored in muscle or bone. The lead researcher, a woman who had once written her doctoral thesis on Homelander's biology, delivered the finding with a tremor in her voice. She used the word transcendent and then apologized for the word and then failed to find a better one. Homelander refused the conclusion. He rejected it in the room, and he rejected it again in private. He told himself that every power had a source, and every source had a valve, and every valve could be closed. He told himself that Blue Marvel's calm was not the product of strength but of a secret, and that all secrets could be pried loose given enough leverage. He began to change tactics. If he could not overpower Adam directly, he would rearrange the world around him until Adam had no room left to stand in. He would target the people Adam had quietly protected over the years. He would engineer disasters that only Adam would feel obligated to answer. He would force Blue Marvel to choose, again and again, between stopping him and saving strangers, and he would watch the strangers pile up until the calm on that face finally cracked. Adam sensed the shift before it fully arrived. He had been watching the news, not for himself, but for the shape of the response. He saw the small anomalies first. A ferry accident in a strait he had once patrolled. A fire in a hospital that had been named, quietly, after a friend of his. A hostage situation in a neighborhood he had spent a summer defending decades before. He understood, with a slow and heavy clarity, that Homelander was no longer challenging him. He was studying him, and the study had begun to take the shape of a hunt. Adam closed his eyes. Somewhere above the city, the atmosphere thickened by a degree that only he could feel. The attacks began at dawn and did not stop. A chemical plant exploded on the Gulf Coast. A commuter train derailed inside a tunnel beneath a river. A skyscraper in the Midwest reported a hostage situation on its 42nd floor. A dam in the mountains began to fail. A convoy of buses full of schoolchildren was surrounded on a highway by masked figures whose strength suggested they had been given something they should not have been given. Every crisis was real. Every crisis was survivable, but only if someone arrived in time. Every crisis was placed exactly far enough from every other crisis to make choice unavoidable. Adam moved. He moved faster than the news could report him. He arrived at the chemical plant before the second explosion could occur, and he held the collapsing structure together long enough for the workers to escape. He arrived at the tunnel before the water could reach the last carriage, and he tore a passage upward through the earth so that the passengers could climb into daylight. He arrived at the skyscraper before the gunmen could carry out their threat, and he disarmed them so gently that none of them remembered afterward how they had come to be sitting on the floor. He arrived at the dam. He arrived at the highway. He arrived and arrived and arrived, and each arrival cost him a fraction of a second he could not spend at the next. He did not complain. He did not slow. He did not, at any point, abandon a civilian in order to pursue Homelander, though several of the crises had been arranged so that pursuit would have been possible. He understood that this was the point. He understood that every choice he made was being watched. He understood, too, that the watching itself was part of the trap. Homelander observed from a private aircraft that circled above the coast. He had a tablet in his lap. On the tablet, small red dots marked each disaster, and small blue dots marked Adam's movements between them. He watched the blue dots dance across the map with something between admiration and hatred. He had expected exhaustion. He had expected failure. He had expected, at least, hesitation. He was receiving none of these. What he received instead was proof of a theory he had been building for days. Blue Marvel could be predicted. Not by his power, which remained beyond Vought's models, but by his conscience. Adam would always go where the innocent were. Adam would always choose the crisis with the highest civilian cost, even when doing so meant walking into the more obvious trap. His compassion was a compass, and a compass, once understood, could be turned. Homelander smiled at the map. He had been raised by men who believed that caring for others was a weakness disguised as a virtue. He had been taught to see empathy as a leash, and he had spent his life cutting that leash wherever he found it in himself. Watching Adam refuse to cut his own leash, watching him instead braid it into a rope and use it to climb, produced in Homelander a reaction he did not have the vocabulary to name. He mistook it for triumph. Adam, in the brief moments between crises, considered the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. He understood that Homelander had studied him and had identified compassion as his central vulnerability. He understood that this identification was itself a kind of confession. A man who saw compassion as a weakness was a man who had never been strong enough to carry it. Adam did not resent the trap. He pitied the trapper. The final crisis was assembled with more care than the others. It took place in a city that had been chosen for its density, its history, and its symbolic weight. A series of coordinated failures began within minutes of one another. A subway collapse, a tower fire, a collapsing bridge that had been engineered, quietly and over months, to fail on cue. The city, unprepared for a coordinated catastrophe of this scale, began to unravel. Adam arrived and immediately understood that this one was different. The scale was too large. The timing was too precise. The disasters were arranged in a pattern that did not merely demand his attention. It demanded all of it. He worked. He held the bridge. He capped the gas. He carried 100 people out of the tower, one armful at a time. He descended into the subway and lifted a section of tunnel long enough for the passengers to walk beneath it into the light. He moved through the city like a weather system, and behind him the city began, slowly, to breathe again. Homelander appeared above him in the middle of the work. He did not attack. He hovered. He watched. He allowed himself to be seen. Adam looked up once. He recognized, immediately, that the appearance was itself a signal. Homelander was not there to fight. He was there to occupy Adam's attention long enough for something else to happen. The something else was already happening. Deep beneath the city, in a facility whose existence had been buried under 3 shell companies and a decade of denials, Vought had installed a device the size of a small building. Its designers had called it the Aperture. Its purpose was to interfere at a frequency Vought scientists had only recently isolated with the strange energy that surrounded Adam Brashear. It had been powered on the moment Homelander appeared in the sky. Adam felt it before he understood it. The air around him thickened in a way that had nothing to do with weather. His movements, which had been precise to the millimeter, began to drift by fractions. His perception, which normally extended in a soft radius around his body, began to narrow. The light that clung to his skin, which most people never noticed and which he had spent decades learning to modulate, began to flicker. For the first time in a very long time, Adam Brashear felt uncertainty in his own body. Homelander saw the flicker. He saw the small stumble. He saw the almost imperceptible slowing. He smiled the smile of a man who had been waiting years for a specific sight. He believed, in that moment, that he had finally found the weakness. He believed that the fight, and with it the world, had at last tilted toward him. He had misunderstood something essential. Adam's greatest strength had never been his power. It had been his understanding of it, and a man who understood his power did not panic when it began to change. He listened to it. He asked it what it needed. He adjusted. Above the city, the clouds began to move in ways that clouds did not normally move. And somewhere in the destabilizing light around Adam Brashear, something older and quieter than any weapon Vought had ever built began, very slowly, to wake. The city looked up. It looked up because it could not help itself. The light above it had changed. It was not the light of morning, though morning had come. It was not the light of storm, though the clouds had begun to arrange themselves into a slow, deliberate spiral. It was a light that seemed to remember something the city had forgotten. People stopped in the middle of streets. Drivers pulled to the curb. A woman in a coffee shop set down her cup and did not pick it up again for a long time. Adam rose from the pavement without appearing to push against it. He simply chose to be higher, and he was. The air around him folded gently, the way water folds around a hand slipped beneath its surface. The flicker in his skin steadied and then brightened. The interference from the aperture, which had briefly made him uncertain of his own dimensions, no longer confused him. He had located it. He had listened to it. He had, with a small internal adjustment that no instrument on Earth could measure, moved his center of resonance a half step away from the frequency Vought had targeted. The device continued to sing at empty air. He continued to exist. Homelander watched from above and mistook the change entirely. He saw the widening halo of light. He saw the atmosphere bend. He saw the electrical grid of the city flicker in sympathy with something it did not understand. He concluded that Blue Marvel was losing control. He had seen enhanced individuals lose control before. He had killed several of them himself and had enjoyed doing so. He prepared to enjoy it again. Adam was not losing control. He had simply decided, at last, to stop restraining it. He had spent decades holding himself in a shape smaller than his true dimensions. He had done so because the world was fragile and because his power was not. He had done so because he had watched, in his younger years, what happened when men of great strength did not learn to fold themselves. He had folded himself so completely that even the instruments designed to measure him had returned only whispers. Now, above a city that Homelander had chosen as a stage, he unfolded. The unfolding was not violent. It was almost gentle. The light around him deepened from a pale blue to something closer to the color of a distant star. His outline sharpened. The air that had been thick a moment before became crystalline, as though the atmosphere had been polished. Adam did not grow. He did not swell. He merely became more fully what he had always been, and the world, sensing the correction, adjusted around him. Homelander attacked before the last of the light had settled. He attacked out of instinct, because instinct was what he had. An instinct told him that any change in an enemy was an opportunity to strike. He came down from the sky at a speed that had, in every previous fight of his life, ended matters before they could begin. Adam met him. The collision happened above the tallest building in the city. It did not break the building because Adam did not allow it to. The shockwave that would have shattered every window for a mile was folded upward instead, released into the empty sky, where it dispersed as a slow ring of pale fire that observers on the ground would remember for the rest of their lives. Homelander was stopped. He was not thrown. He was held. He struggled. Adam released him, and the fight resumed, but the terms had changed. Homelander no longer set the pace. Every strike he threw was answered before it landed. Every angle he chose had already been closed. Every burst of heat vision was absorbed and returned as a soft, harmless light against his own chest. He had spent his life fighting by instinct, and he was now fighting a man who had spent his life understanding. The battle rose. It rose out of the city, out of the smoke, out of the reach of the drones that had been sent to record it. It climbed through cloud layers and past the altitude at which airplanes cruised. It climbed until the curve of the earth became visible below them, and the horizon curled downward on both sides like the edge of a bowl. Homelander was screaming now. The sound did not carry in the thinning air, but his mouth was open, and his eyes had gone wide, and his fists were moving faster than his own mind could plan them. He struck at Adam with the last coherent tactics he possessed, and then, when those failed, he struck without tactic. He struck the way a drowning man strikes water. Adam absorbed the assault. He absorbed it without effort, and then, in a voice that carried through vacuum by means Homelander could not understand, he began to speak. He said that power did not become meaningful because others feared it. He said that fear was the cheapest currency in the world, and that any child with a match could buy it. He said that power became meaningful because of what a person chose to do with it, and that the choosing was the whole of the story. He said that Homelander had been given something enormous and had spent his life spending it on himself, and that the debt had come due. Homelander rejected the words. He rejected them with another strike, and another, and another. He rejected them because to accept them would have required him to look at his life, and he had built his life precisely so that he would never have to look at it. Adam let him strike until he was finished. Then, with a movement that seemed almost sorrowful, he ended the fight. He did not kill. He caught the last blow, closed his hand around Homelander's wrist, and pulled him gently downward through the atmosphere, absorbing the heat of re-entry so that neither of them burned. He carried him the way a father carries an exhausted child. He set him down, softly, on the roof of a building at the edge of the city, and he stepped back. Homelander lay on his back. His chest heaved. His cape was torn. His eyes, for the first time in his adult life, were fixed on a sky he did not own. He understood, slowly, what had happened, not the loss. The loss he could have survived. He understood that Adam had, at several points in the fight, held his life in his hands. He understood that Adam had chosen each time to give it back. He understood that his continued existence was not a victory he had wrested from his enemy. It was a gift his enemy had decided to grant him. The understanding was worse than any wound. It sat in his chest like a stone that would not be moved. He had been spared, and the sparing was a verdict. Above him, Adam looked down once. Then he rose again into the light, and the light closed around him, and the city below began, at last, to breathe. Homelander vanished from the world for 11 days. Vought announced a period of recovery. The public was told that he had sustained no injuries of significance, and that the rest was a matter of protocol. The statement was drafted by 3 separate teams and rewritten 7 times. It fooled no one. The silence itself was the story. The silence, which had once been unthinkable, became the new sound of the age. Inside a subterranean facility beneath a Vought research campus, Homelander did not rest. He walked. He walked in circles around a room that had been reinforced to survive a small nuclear event, and the reinforcement did nothing to contain the thing that was building inside him. He did not shout. He did not break furniture. The rage of the penthouse had burned itself out. What replaced it was colder, and colder things travel farther. He began to plan. The plan was not, at first, a plan to win. He had accepted, in a small, private chamber of his mind, that he did not admit existed, that winning against Blue Marvel might not be possible in the way he had once understood winning. He adjusted the definition. If he could not defeat Adam, he could remove the reasons Adam fought. He could hollow out the world beneath him until there was nothing left to protect. He could turn the compassion that had been Adam's compass into a weight that dragged him down. He summoned the executives again. This time they did not arrive pale. They arrived resigned. They had watched the stock, and they had read the polling, and they had understood that their fortunes were now tied to a man whose fortunes had turned. They did what Vought had always done. They calculated, and they complied. Homelander demanded resources on a scale Vought had never before authorized. He demanded access to every enhanced individual on the company's roster, including several whose existence had never been disclosed. He demanded the release of experimental compounds that had been shelved as too unstable for public use. He demanded control of Vought's private security force, its logistics network, its media division, and its relationships with 3 foreign governments. The board hesitated. He looked at them without speaking, and the hesitation ended. The preparations moved quickly because Vought was a machine that had been built to move quickly, and because the men and women who operated it had long ago traded their consciences for stock options. Within a week, cargo planes began to move across continents. Within 2, entire supply chains had been redirected. Within 3, the world began to notice. The noticing came first as a series of small anomalies. A city in the Balkans reported that its power grid had been briefly commandeered by a signal it could not trace. A satellite over the Pacific went silent and then, 12 hours later, resumed transmission with a slightly different orbit. A group of enhanced individuals who had been quietly living civilian lives in 3 different countries received visits from men in dark suits and afterward could not be reached by their families. A minor conflict in a region that had been stable for a decade erupted overnight, and the weapons used by both sides bore serial numbers that led, through a chain of shell companies, back to a Vought subsidiary. Governments began to panic. They panicked in the quiet way that governments panic, which is to say that their public statements grew calmer as their private meetings grew louder. Emergency sessions were convened. Alliances were re-examined. The word Vought, which had for years been synonymous with safety, began to appear in classified briefings under headings that had previously been reserved for hostile states. Adam watched the pattern form. He watched it from a small apartment, from a mountain ridge, from the deck of a fishing boat off a coast he had loved in his youth. He moved often now, not to hide, but to listen. He understood that Homelander was no longer trying to win a fight. He was trying to poison a world. He was trying to prove, by making the world unworthy of protection, that protection had been foolish all along. Adam understood, too, that punching Homelander again would not solve the problem. Homelander was the loudest expression of a system, but the system had many voices. Vought had built an infrastructure of harm that would outlive any single man. To defeat Homelander without dismantling the machine that had produced him would only clear a throne for the next occupant. He made a decision. He decided to walk into Vought's central facility, unarmed, uninvited, and alone. He decided to end the machine, not by breaking it, but by exposing it. He would carry with him every document, every recording, every proof he had gathered over the weeks of quiet research. He would place them on the table of the world and let the world decide what to do with what it saw. He did not reach the facility. Homelander appeared before he crossed the last mile. He appeared not from above, as he had always appeared before, but from ground level, walking out of a low mist that clung to a field of dying grass. He was not smiling. His cape was gone. His costume had been replaced by something darker, less ceremonial, more functional. He looked, for the first time in his life, like a man rather than a symbol. The 2 men faced one another across a broken landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a city burned quietly, its fire tended by forces neither of them controlled. The sky above them was the color of old bronze. Homelander spoke first. His voice was low. He said that he had never been afraid of anything until Adam. He said that the fear had not left him after the first fight, or the second, and that he had discovered, in the days of his silence, that fear did not obey the rules he had been taught to apply to it. He said that he had tried to be a god, and that gods, as it turned out, were not permitted to be afraid. Adam listened. He did not interrupt. He understood that this was the closest thing to a confession Homelander had ever offered, and that it was being offered not to him but to the empty air between them, and that the offering was itself a kind of grief. Then Homelander turned the fear into rage. He did it visibly, the way a man puts on a coat. His shoulders squared, his jaw set. The small human thing that had briefly appeared in his face folded itself away and was gone. He said that if he could not be a god, he would at least be the last thing the world remembered. He rose into the sky. Adam rose with him. Behind them, the city burned a little brighter, and the final battle began. They climbed. They climbed past the birds and past the highest flights of aircraft and past the layer where the air began to thin into memory. They climbed until the light around them grew cleaner and the noise of the world fell away. And still they climbed, because Homelander did not want witnesses, and Adam did not want to break what was beneath them. The earth curved into a great slow shoulder below their feet, and the horizon became a curve of pale gold, and above them the sky darkened by degrees into the deep blue that precedes the black. Homelander struck first, as he had always struck first, but the striking had changed. He no longer fought to entertain. He no longer fought to prove. He fought the way a cornered animal fights, without economy, without care, without the memory of any lesson he had ever been given. Every blow carried the accumulated weight of every humiliation he had suffered since the Field of Pines, and every blow was met, and every meeting rang across the upper atmosphere like the tolling of a bell no instrument on earth was tuned to hear. Adam did not speak. He had said, in the previous fight, everything he had believed needed to be said. He had offered the philosophy, and it had been rejected. He would not offer it again. He fought now with the quiet attention of a man closing a book he had hoped to leave open. Each of his movements was small, precise, and complete. He did not throw wide punches. He did not roar. He simply corrected the space around him whenever Homelander disturbed it, and the corrections were themselves devastating. Homelander screamed that he deserved to win. He screamed it into the vacuum, where the words did not carry. But Adam heard them anyway, because Adam heard many things. He screamed that he had been made for this, that he had been promised this, that the world owed him this. The screaming was not directed at Adam. It was directed at every executive who had shaped him, every scientist who had measured him, every audience that had cheered him, every mother who had shushed her child in his presence. The screaming was a life being emptied. Adam listened without pity and without contempt. He listened the way a physician listens to a heart that has finally begun to speak the truth about its condition. The fight grew. It grew in scale and in strangeness. The two men moved so quickly that their passage left visible arcs in the thinning air. They collided in ways that produced brief pockets of superheated plasma. They separated and returned and separated again, and each cycle carried them further from any place where ordinary rules applied. Below them, the earth continued to turn, indifferent and beloved, and the small fires of the world Homelander had been poisoning continued to burn. And every one of those fires was, to Adam, a reason to keep his hands steady. Homelander landed the blow at last. He landed it because Adam allowed a fraction of attention to drift downward toward a coastline he had once walked, and because Homelander, whatever else he was still the fastest thing Vought had ever built. The strike caught Adam across the temple. The sound of it was not a sound. It was a silence so complete that the stars themselves seemed to lean closer to hear what would follow. Adam fell. He fell in a long, slow arc, tumbling through the upper atmosphere with the unhurried motion of something too large to be affected by ordinary gravity. The earth rose to meet him. His outline dimmed. The pale blue light that had surrounded him for so much of the fight guttered like a candle in a wind. The world, watching by every instrument it possessed, believed for a full breath that Blue Marvel had lost. Homelander believed it too. He descended after him, riding the fall like a man riding a horse toward a finish line. He prepared, in the last moments of the descent, the words he would use afterward. He prepared the pose he would strike. He prepared the smile. Even in the middle of a battle above the sky, he could not stop preparing his image, because his image was the only country he had ever truly lived in. Adam rose. He rose not because he was angry. He rose because he had glimpsed, in the moment of his falling, a small town at the edge of the coast where a school had just released its children for the afternoon. He rose because those children did not know that anything above them was happening. He rose because they should not have to know. The rising was quiet. It was almost apologetic. The pale blue light that had guttered steadied and then brightened and then bloomed outward in a slow, deliberate wave, and the wave met Homelander in the middle of his descent and stopped him as gently as a hand stops a door. Homelander looked into Adam's face and saw, for the first time, that the calm had never been distance. It had been focus. Adam had not been unmoved by the fight. He had been holding the fight, all along, at a specific and chosen depth of himself, so that no part of it would spill onto the people below. The final phase of the battle was not long. It could not be. Adam had decided that the fight would end, and when Adam decided a thing at that altitude, the thing tended to obey. He moved through Homelander's remaining defenses the way water moves through a broken dam. He did not injure him beyond what was necessary. He did not humiliate him. He simply, and with a terrible economy, ended the possibility of further violence. Homelander was disarmed. His speed was matched and neutralized. His heat vision was absorbed and dispersed. His strength, which had been the central fact of his existence, met a strength that did not require display, and the meeting was final. He hung in the air, held by a light he could not break, and he waited for the death he had always secretly believed he deserved. Adam did not deliver it. He remembered, in the long moment of his choosing, every face that had crossed the files, every family, every quiet grave, every unrecorded cruelty. He remembered the child in the coffee shop who had asked whether Homelander was going to cry. He remembered the mother who had shushed her. He remembered 100 small towns that had learned to live under the shadow of a smile they had been told to trust. The memory was very heavy. It would have been easy, in that moment, to become the thing he was fighting. It would have been almost righteous. He set the memory down. He set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something he intends to return to later. He looked at Homelander and he said, softly, that killing him would only teach the world a new kind of fear, and that the world already had enough kinds. He carried him downward through the atmosphere. He carried him past the layer of thinning air, past the birds, past the clouds. He set him, at last, on a patch of open ground far from any city, and he stood over him for a long moment without speaking. Homelander did not rise. He could not. His reign, which had been built on the impossibility of his defeat, ended in the small, ordinary silence of a man lying on grass. Adam turned his back and walked away. The sky above him closed gently, and the world, which had held its breath for weeks, finally exhaled. The world that followed did not celebrate loudly. It could not. It had spent too long cheering for the wrong things, and the memory of that cheering sat in its throat like a stone. Instead, it began, slowly, to rebuild. Investigations opened, committees convened. Documents that had been buried for decades were unsealed and read aloud in rooms that had once been reserved for the polite defense of the indefensible. The word Vought, which had been printed on school books and on the sides of aircraft, began to appear in indictments. The truth about Compound V spread the way water spreads across a floor. It went everywhere. It reached parents who understood, for the first time, why certain neighborhoods had produced certain children. It reached veterans who understood why certain missions had ended the way they had. It reached the ordinary viewers who had, for years, watched heroes on their screens and had felt, without knowing why, a small unease at the corners of the spectacle. The unease had a name now. The name was on the news. Homelander survived. He was imprisoned in a facility designed quietly and at enormous expense to hold a man whose body did not obey ordinary rules. The facility had no cameras trained inward. It had no audience. It had no executives whispering into headsets. It had walls and light and silence and a schedule of meals delivered by machines that did not look at him. For the first time in his life, he was alone with himself, and the aloneness was the punishment. He had spent decades avoiding the man beneath the cape, and now he was locked in a room with him. Adam did not attend the trials. He did not give interviews. He did not accept the medals that several governments tried, with varying degrees of embarrassment, to offer him. He returned to the quiet life he had built and rebuilt many times, and he watched the world from a distance, as he had always watched it. He appeared occasionally at small crises. He disappeared before anyone could photograph him. He allowed the world to forget the shape of his face, and the world gratefully obliged. Years later, on a street corner in a city that had been rebuilt from the fires of the last battle, a young child stopped him. The child did not recognize him. The child simply thought he looked like a man who would answer a question honestly. The child asked whether Homelander had been the strongest being on Earth. Adam considered the question. He considered it for longer than the child expected. He looked up at a sky that was, that afternoon, an ordinary and untroubled blue. He looked down at the child, who was holding a small paper cup of something warm. He said softly that Homelander had not been the strongest. He said that Homelander had simply been the loudest, and that the world had once mistaken loudness for strength, and that it had cost the world a great deal to learn the difference. The child nodded in the serious way that children nod when they have been told something they intend to remember. Then the child walked on. Adam stood at the corner for a long moment after the child had gone. He thought about the two philosophies that had shaped the age now ending. He thought about the man who had believed power meant the right to command, and about the man himself who had believed power meant the duty to protect. He thought about how narrow the space between those two beliefs had been, and how wide the consequences. He thought, finally, about the question that had not been asked, and that would need to be answered by others. What would happen when humanity learned, again, how to create another Homelander? Somewhere far from that street corner, in a laboratory that was being emptied by uniformed officials, a scientist moved through the packing with the practiced calm of a person who had rehearsed this moment many times. She signed the form she was asked to sign. She surrendered the badges she was asked to surrender. She smiled at the officer who thanked her for her cooperation. As she left, she carried a small container in the inside pocket of her coat. The container was warm against her ribs. Inside it, held in a suspension that would keep for years, was a sample of the compound the world had just learned to fear. She walked out into the afternoon. The sky above her was blue. The city around her was rebuilding. The age of Homelander was over. The age of superhumans had only begun.